Hi everybody, welcome back. So in this video, I wanted to talk about the recent end of support for CentOS 8, but also more generally, a couple different things, which are going to be what we can take away from this and an argument for why you should use FreeBSD in addition to Linux. So this is a video that I was planning on talking about this topic anyway, but given the recent end of support for CentOS 8, and just to give context in case anybody does not know, CentOS has been around for a very long time as a project. It basically was a version of Red Hat Enterprise with all of the images and copywritten material owned by Red Hat stripped out and then recompiled and released to the community. A number of years ago, prior to IBM's acquisition of Red Hat, IBM acquired the company behind CentOS, as it had formerly become a company that was supporting the project, and took over maintenance of CentOS. CentOS is a distribution of Linux that is designed to be used on the server, as it's based on Red Hat Enterprise, and it was a really good testing ground for people who wanted to go use Red Hat Enterprise, but also for people who wanted to be using a mainline, widely supported, widely used server distribution, but did not need Red Hat support, thus did not want to go pay the services. So for example, if you were running a high performance computing cluster where you had 1,000 nodes, CentOS was a really common choice to use in that situation because it would just be cost prohibitive to get 1,000 licenses for Red Hat support. And also what you're doing is very specialized. The people that you have working on it probably know as much or more about this than the support engineers that you generally would be interacting with at a company like Red Hat. So it's a really good option for people. It's a distribution that I've used in the past on my own servers, and a lot of people use. But it's worth putting into context the reason why the CentOS project exists. And ironically, in terms of versioning, it mirrors what we're looking at right now, which is there was a point where you could just download Red Hat Linux. There was no enterprise version. There was just regular Red Hat Linux. And then you could go ahead and purchase support if you would like to. But if you didn't want to, you could just go run Red Hat version 7.3 without the enterprise part at the end of it. They started new versioning. And when they, I think, came to version 8 or got very close to version 8, they decided that they actually wanted to change their support model. So they had a separate distribution that was going to be called Red Hat Enterprise. And people were like, whoa, that's a little bit scary. We've been using this on our servers for quite a while. Red Hat is one of the major providers of Linux. We need to go figure out some way to work around this because, the version that you would download from Red Hat would have a satellite update server configuration, and it would get the updates directly from Red Hat, and you would need to have a license in order to go download software updates. You could download Red Hat Enterprise, but you couldn't effectively use it in a production system because you couldn't get updates for it. So at about that time, if memory serves, people said, let's go create a new version of Linux, which will be identical to Red Hat Enterprise, and they called it CentOS. So we've seen this before. We've seen this with Red Hat, and we've seen this really in a very similar situation when it comes to versioning, which is kind of ironic. And the big takeaway from this, and the quote that I had on the title is 2 is 1 and 1 is none. And it's a very common saying that you'll hear in any kind of engineering that requires highly available systems, right? So anything that requires highly available systems, you will hear this talked about. Probably the most often group to use this term or use this quote. I don't know who to attribute it to. Unfortunately, I'm sure that that's it should be properly attributed to somebody, but unfortunately, I don't know who that is. But the most common group that you'll hear this with is backup admins, right? So you'll hear this phrase used almost like a mantra from backup admins, storage admins as well, and other groups within IT. But backup admins, you will especially hear this because the idea is if you want to have your data protected, you want to have two copies of it, right? Because at some point, that copy is going to fail, right? One of those copies is going to go away. So if you only have one copy and failure is inevitable, right, you have zero copies, right? Because one eventually becomes none, right? So that's important to realize. So we don't want to have none. So let's make sure that we have at least two, right? Because when we have our inevitable failure of one, right, that leaves us with another copy that's remaining. So we always want to make sure that we have two copies. So how does this work in this context, right? Well, in this context, there's a couple things that are worth noting, right? So one, Linux is well suited to this problem. Right. So not only is this a problem that we've seen in the past, I think this is one of the cardinal virtues of working with Linux, of being in an open source ecosystem, right? Because if Microsoft decided they don't want to support an operating system anymore, that operating system is no longer supported, right? You're done, right? Now, there are some niche companies where you might be able to go get security updates backported and things like that. But generally speaking, once a commercial OS vendor decides that their operating system is no longer supported, it's no longer supported, end of story. Whereas Linux, we fork, right? And there's already Rocky Linux, right? That has been announced by the project lead for CentOS. So basically, I don't know exactly what his role is, but he's either the original founder of CentOS or he's the head of CentOS. Has basically announced that they're going to go ahead and create a new version of CentOS that's not going to be owned and managed by Red Hat called Rocky Linux. But I think the thing that we want to go take away from this is that you want to have two OSs that your applications run on. And again, the context of this is this channel is targeted mainly at people who work in IT, who work in DevOps, who work in the tech sector. So one of the things that you want to be thinking about is making sure that your environment, is reproducible in another operating systems. So for our purposes, I want to point out that SUSE, who I do have a commercial relationship with, I'll put that out there. This does not help me directly in any way, but I am a SUSE certified instructor. So I occasionally teach classes for them. It's been pretty few and far between, so I don't have a huge financial stake there. But SUSE is an RPM-based distribution, so a lot of overlap with Red Hat. They are the second largest Linux distribution in terms of enterprise use, and they have a lot of really good support offerings, especially in that OpenSUSE Leap is identical in every single way to SUSE Enterprise Linux. And not only is it identical, the only difference is the licensing around support. So at any point, if you have a OpenSUSE Leap server, you can actually purchase a support license and just turn it on. So it's more or less like CentOS, identical to the enterprise supported version of this. But it actually in some ways is better because you can actually just turn on support and you're good and you're done. That may be something you can go do with CentOS. It's been a while since I've used it, so that may be a feature that they have adopted. It may not be unique to SUSE, but I've always found that to be really interesting. Also, I like their distribution. Like it's quite nice. Also, easy to adopt. Their tooling with things like Yast as a setup tool makes transitioning to Linux generally, or from a different distribution of Linux to SUSE to be pretty good. Also, they get very, very good documentation. So that's one option. The second one, which I think a lot of people don't realize, is Canonical, which I think I just spelled wrong. But Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu Linux, which you may or may not want to use on a server. I personally have no problem with it. It might have slightly more overhead than something like CentOS or OpenSUSE, but I don't think it would be dramatically more, especially if you go set it up as a server. They have a specific server distribution as well as a minimal distribution. But Canonical does have support for SUSE. You can purchase support contracts, not with SUSE, but Canonical has support for Ubuntu Linux in the enterprise. So both of those would be viable replacements for CentOS, right? The third thing that I want to mention is FreeBSD. So, as a number of you guys who follow the channel know, I've got a bit of a soft spot for FreeBSD. I like the BSD model. I like the licensing behind BSD. And I like the elegance of the operating system. It's much more designed and engineered, and we see that there's a number of problems that Linux has that BSD just doesn't have, namely things like app images and Flatpaks and snap packages, all of which are trying to solve issues where the operating system team, the kernel team is probably better to say, and the userland people are different groups of people, right? Which means that the libraries change quite a bit, and there's a lot of issues around library consistency in Linux. BSD generally doesn't have those same problems. Now, there's a lot of shared overlap in terms of tooling, so they do have some of it, but it's not nearly as much of an issue with BSD compared to Linux. Additionally, their emphasis on long-term stability versus lots of change, that issue just kind of goes out of the window. So you don't generally have the same kind of issues where an application from a few years ago is going to break because it doesn't have a library. But the context that I wanted to talk about it in was SUSE, Canonical, both great versions of Linux, right? And there's tons of great versions of Linux out there, and I don't want this to come off as me knocking Linux. What I want to do is I want to go back to this saying, which is 2 is 1, 1 is none. If we look at Linux generally as an operating system, right, and we have different flavors of it, absolutely, and that gives us a lot more robustness and reliability that we might see with maybe a System 5 version of Unix like Solaris or AIX or HPUX. It's still one version. Well, it's still an operating system, right? It has a kernel and it has user land space, right? And those are separate, but as a thing, there's it's an operating system, right? So lots of different variations on it, but it's an operating system. So it would probably be a good idea to have two, right? Don't just have Linux. Like if you're a corporation and your business runs on Linux, I don't have any expectation that Linux is going to go away, but it's probably a good idea to have another operating system that your business will run on, because Linux changes a lot, and there may be things that your application need in order to work that could go away, right? So invest in tooling, right? So invest in something like Ansible. And it doesn't have to be Ansible. I'm just mentioning that because it's the most common one out there. Personally, I like Salt. Right, Salt Stack is really really nice, but you could use Puppet, you could use Terraform. There's a bunch of different ways. But instead of having like just a script that's going to go run on Linux to go set your application up and configure it, why not go ahead and have Ansible be able to go deploy to Linux and as well deploy to BSD. Right, this could be FreeBSD, this could be OpenBSD, whatever it is. Could be something like Solaris as well. Now, personally, I wouldn't do that because of licensing. But what I would do is I would have the ability to go run my application on multiple platforms. And, this might be because, let's say, your application has some dependencies and, Linux decides that as an ecosystem, they want to go in a different direction. And we've seen this with like Systemd, for example, right? Where Systemd, putting aside whether or not you like that model or whether you don't like that model, Systemd is a fairly major change to the way that they do things in Linux. Now, to their credit, they have been really good about backwards compatibility as far as they can go. But they have broken things, right? So, for example, if you had automation that was going to go change like the etc resolve.conf, well, Systemd now manages resolve.conf. Let's say you had an application that interacted with something like NTP in a particular way or relied on cron. Well, Systemd is taking ownership of those areas of the operating system as well. And again, you do have backwards compatibility, but as time goes by, right, that may become less and less common. So if we can go ahead and have, more universal ways of doing things that can work in both Linux and BSD, well, now you've got redundancy, right? So it protects you against, Linux no longer running your application or forcing you to invest a huge amount of money into modernizing or rewriting or changing your application. You could just go switch to BSD. Now, in that case, you'd probably have the same issue where you'd want to go ahead and diversify. So I still think it would be a good idea to run both, but something to consider. But there's another issue that we could see with like security issues, right? So you might have something like a 0-day exploit that affects Linux. And because they're two completely separate code bases, it may not affect BSD. Right now, the inverse might happen, right? Which is why I think that it's a good idea for people who run BSD to also have, some Linux servers around. I'm not somebody who is a purist or an evangelist for just one way of doing things. I'm a practicalist, right? I'm a pragmatist, right? I want to go ahead and do things as reliably and easily as possible. So do both, right? Have some Linux systems, have some BSD systems, make sure that your application can go run on both of them. And that's going to give you a higher level of fault tolerance in terms of something like your distribution going away, or the support model changing, or the libraries that you were expecting to be there no longer being maintained on that distribution, or whatever it is, right? 2 is 1, 1 is none, right? So have 2, right? So for all of you guys who have been affected by this, man, I'm sorry. It's going to suck. I'm sorry that you guys are going to have a decent bit of work that you're going to need to go do to move your servers to a different version of Linux, or whatever you choose to move it to. That's a huge hassle. But what I would say is try to learn from this experience and look for scenarios that you could be tied to a particular vendor. I think this is one of the biggest arguments that Linux has, or the open source community has, because I think BSD can make the same argument, which is worst case scenario, you can take over that operating system yourself if you had the ability, or hire people to go do that. Whereas if you're running something like Microsoft as your OS, you're a lot more limited in terms of what your options are if they change the way that they want to go do things. So it's always a really good idea to have flexibility, and I think that it's going to be a really big area where open source generally kind of wins in terms of how to go ahead and approach deploying things and sort of working in an enterprise environment with highly reliable services. But look for other areas too, right? So one of the things that I see a lot of people doing, which to me is a mistake, right? But they're going all in on, like, say, AWS. I have no problem with AWS. I think AWS and cloud services are fantastic. I've got AWS certifications. That's great, but don't use their specific tooling, right? Don't use CloudFormation, right? CloudFormation is owned by Amazon, right? So it's gonna only be doing Amazon stuff. So if you decide that you want to go move to Azure or Google Cloud, right? Well, now you're gonna have to go rewrite all of your setup stuff. Use Ansible, use Terraform, use something along those lines, right? It maintains portability. Better yet, use Azure, right, or GCP at the same time. Have some of your stuff running on AWS and have some of your stuff running in Google Cloud. Don't pick just one provider. Use multiple, right? Hell, I don't think it would be a terrible thing to have Windows in the mix for some stuff in your environment, as a mechanism to have more redundancy, right? Is it my preferred server operating system? No. Can you use it to go run things like MySQL, right, or a web server? Yeah, absolutely. They can definitely do that. Is it more expensive because of licensing and things? Sure. But, maybe for some core services, it's not a bad idea to have things like your internal DNS run on, bind and Active Directory. Have it replicate. And that way, if there's something that takes out your Linux systems that are running bind, well, your Windows ones are still up. And if there's something that takes out your Windows servers, your Linux servers are still up. I don't think that's a terrible idea. Now, I would probably lean more towards, the Unix side of things, because that's, my preference. But I don't think that's a bad decision. I mean, if I was talking to somebody and they said, "Oh yeah, we're a mixed environment. We run Windows and Linux and Solaris," right? I'd say, well, cool. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good idea. If you're going to be running enterprise storage systems, well, that's not a bad idea to do multiple. I always think that if you're going to be running something where it takes a large investment of time, have one that's your sort of primary, and then the secondary is a little bit smaller. But if you're like a NetApp shop, yeah, have a Pure system kicking around, right? If you're an EMC shop, right, have a NetApp, right? Whatever it is, like it's not a bad idea. Just have some redundancy in your systems, right? Don't just have one. So as much as this is a crappy situation, let's try to take some lessons away from it and learn some things, right? Don't just have one upstream internet provider if you have a data center, right? Have two, right? And make sure that they don't share fiber 20 miles down the road, because that's happened to me. I had a data center that went away, or, from the internet's point of view, went away because both of the upstream internet providers went down at the same time. That was not a fun day. Make sure that you look for any area where you could be affected in a similar way to what's going on with CentOS 8. And yeah, if you know somebody who is being affected by this, be nice to them. Right? Buy them a beer, answer their questions in forums. If you're somebody with the BSD background, or more of an Ubuntu or a SUSE background, or one of the distributions that these guys might be moving to, I know it might be a little bit annoying in your forums to see a whole bunch of Red Hat people coming in asking questions, but be nice to them if you can. Help them out, answer their questions. If there's any of you guys who are a little bit more junior and looking for work, one of the things that I would do is I would set up a project at home to go migrate some services from a CentOS machine to a OpenSUSE machine, or maybe go out and get like an OpenSUSE certification, and not an OpenSUSE, but a SUSE certification, and update your resume so that it specifically says that you've done Red Hat or CentOS migrations to insert the operating system, because that might be some really good consulting opportunities or work. And heck, if any of you guys are in that situation and you're stuck and you need a hand, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to answer questions. And I do consulting as well. So, yeah, I feel for you. I've been in situations like this myself. I remember when Oracle bought Sun. I was a pretty big Solaris guy, and obviously the approach of Oracle when it comes to Solaris versus traditional Sun Microsystems was a very different story. So I remember the kind of pain of that. So yeah, if anybody has questions and you need a hand with things, feel free to shoot me an email, or leave a comment on this video, and if I can help you or send you in a direction. If you need any training when it comes to something like SUSE, let me know. I generally work through Fastlane, but we can help out with that, and try to get people up to speed in terms of transitioning. So that's definitely a thing to look at doing. So anyway, take care of yourselves. Hopefully we'll have another video up soon, but by the time this one comes out, I'm guessing it's going to be on the 19th. So for those of you guys who celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas. I hope that you have a good time with your family, and or if you can't be with your family, that you're at least figuring out a way to enjoy it. And yeah, take care. Happy New Year. Probably have a video out by then, but be good to each other, and good luck migrating off of CentOS. And sorry that you guys need to deal with that. Take care.